We had a baby. We had lots of little babies. Lots of little kids.
Lots of little kids.
Music. Music. Now we had some of that too, some music going on. All right, so I don't know if I'm going to do this for you in the future. Maybe I will. The first part, and I don't want to give away the the punchline. But what I did is I tried to outline and this isn't really what it would call it. This isn't a concise outline. This is kind of a verse outline of the argument that John is making. So I'm going to go over that in a second, but I want to start. Let's get to the punchline. I want to get to the punchline. So we can see we can get to the punchline. There it is. It's awake. Wake up. Okay, that should be broadcasting. I push the home button. The home button, and then this one. I love this thing. This is so cool. Okay, yeah, look at that. First of all, to finish up on that verse 14. Verse 14, let me see. What is the verse? You got it written down for you, but I'll help you. Here we go. So this is verse 14. This is that cultural translation. So that's why it seems a little strange and odd. The logical argument, he caused to become flesh and to dwell in a vessel that produces shade with us. And we look closely at his inherent intrinsic worth, an inherent intrinsic worth of the only born beside the Father, abounding in graciousness of act and not faults. And I just have to point out this again. You know, we translate, usually we say at the right hand of God or something like that, but the words that are used are always like in the throne of God, that in the Greek it says he is like sitting beside the Father. And we know he's the same as the Father, but the word usage to me is just beautiful, right? Because we get the impression from our culture that it's Jesus is sitting beside God on another throne or something, right? Lower. But yet the Greek intent is that the argument of John is he is the same as God. He is God. That's what we trust in. But the Greek says he is beside the Father. So they're sharing the same throne. They're in the same place, which is really fun. So with this in mind, then there is, it won't work on this, I have to do this one, right?
That's be a way for you to move that.
Well, I know ways to write on the screen, but I'm afraid to, because I know it's difficult to erase it till I have to, because with Microsoft Draw I can actually draw on the screen, but I can't draw on this screen the same way. Well, whatever. This has an apocryphal allusion. Everyone reads the Psalms of Solomon, probably not. If you don't, you should. But this, I've told you before, we don't study, which is really funny. For 200 years, we have not studied the apocryphal works, but everybody before that, including Martin Luther and every Bible in the world, included the Apocrypha until 1826, when we removed it for cost reasons. But this is from the Psalms of Solomon, an apocryphal allusion, and I've kind of put it in a rabbinic context. While your name lives among us, we shall receive mercy, and the Gentile will not overcome us. I make not thy dwelling afar from us, O God, lest they assail us with hate, us that hate us without cause. For thou hast rejected them, O God, let not their foot trample upon thy holy inheritance. Chase us thyself with a good pleasure, but give us not up to the nations. For if thou sendest pestilence, thou thyself givest a charge concerning us. For thou art merciful, and will not be angry to the point of consuming us. While thy name dwelleth in our midst, we shall find mercy, and nations shall not prevail against us. For thou art our shield, and when we call upon thee, thou hearkenest to us. For thou wilt pity the seed of Israel forever, and thou wilt not reject them. But we shall be under thy yoke forever, and under the rod of thy chastening. Thou wilt establish us in the time that thou helps us, showing mercy to the house of Jacob on the day wherein thou dost promise to help them. What is interesting about this allusion is, look back at the verse. That whole rabbinic context is about Israel and about protecting Israel. And yet, look what it says. In the logical argument, he caused to become flesh and dwell in a vessel that produces shade with us, and we look closely at his inherent intrinsic worth, etc. So this is paralleled in the apocryphal work, but the apocryphal work is about Israel and protecting Israel and the house of Jacob, right? It's not in here directly. But you see this? When the readers heard this, what were they thinking? Right? So there's depth in this, really great depth, that of course we miss because unfortunately I have not memorized the Septuagint, and I know you haven't either, or maybe you have and you're just not, you're hiding it. But if you know it, go ahead and throw it out whenever we hit something that I've missed. I try to get all these apocryphal allusions. I have when I go start these, what I do is I try to grab every apocryphal allusion there is, and there's actually someone who's compiled them. And the compilation is about 60 pages. So I have to boil down all of those, and it takes about 4 hours to do that for each work, for each, book. But it's still fun. But it's interesting, right? So this is the next verse. And the NIV says, John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." And this is the Greek. We can refer back to it if we need to. But I'm going to go ahead. Here's the King James. I like to show you the King James because I think it's a little closer to the direct word usage. John bare witness of him and cried, saying, This was he of whom I spake. He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. Let's see what it literally said. Okay, don't let this hurt your brains. I know this kind of hurts my brain. I have to think through this a lot, but this is the Greek. This is the direct translation of the Greek. So here's the Greek Romanized version. Then there's the translation. Johannes, John, Martyri, witness. Martyr means witness in Greek. Peri, through all over. Auto of him, Kai-an, Kragan, he cried out loudly with an urgent scream or shriek, which is really an interesting thing, the way we translate it, right? Lagon, speaking a logical argument. He was, and there we go. We have that direct address, right? He was whom I said, and epon, the I, ego, there's no ego. This is a presumed pronoun, because epon is, remember I told you they take cases, etc. So this is the first person. We look back. I know this may be a little boring part, but that's okay. To me, it's kind of interesting because this is how I figure this stuff out anyway. This is how everybody figures this out. Epon. Epon means to say or said. It's the past tense. It's common Greek for said. It doesn't specify how it was said, just that it was said in the past. And so if you look, it's first person singular. So therefore it implies I. And so anytime you see that in Greek, because there's two reasons Greek did this in writing. Number one, we don't know how the speaking was. We have no idea how the speaking language was. But I suspect the speaking language was similar. When you don't need to say the pronoun, you don't need to say the pronoun, right? And they didn't like to say the pronoun, especially I's, he's, etc. They only put them in when they needed to specify. It also does something else when you're writing it down. Saves paper, right? So what a cool thing. It's really good if your language saves paper, but we don't know really, we don't have recordings yet. Maybe in the future we'll have recordings. I wrote my book, The Second Mission, is about going back in the past and recording Socrates' words. So maybe in the future somebody will do that and we'll be able to hear how the ancient Greeks actually spoke. But all we know is this is how they wrote. And you usually write how you speak. So we suspect they did this. But what a cool thing, right? When you're saving paper and every letter is worth a bunch of bucks and you can not have to put them in, I think that's pretty neat. In English, we write everything out, so we would probably write the same thing. It would take us 3 or 4 paragraphs. Whom I said, and it's nice to know what who and whom is in English because it does matter. I said, the back, behind, after of me, he is coming or going. This word means to come or go. And I like to put them both in so that we see a choice, because it can mean either, but it's contextual. Proston, in front of, moi, of me, gegogen, he is caused to be, because foremost of me he was. And there's again that definite, the identification form, was, which, like I told you, we don't see very often in classical Greek. We don't see it in the other Gospels, but we see a lot in John. So here's a translation. John witnesses all over of him, and he cried out loudly with an urgent scream. I like that. I want to leave that in, because we translate it out because it's just a cry in the wilderness, right? An urgent scream. Remember, in those days, they didn't have artificial amplifiers and stuff, so yeah, you better be screaming if you don't be heard over a crowd. Speaking a logical argument, he was whom I said, he is coming after me. He was caused to be in ahead of me, because he was before me. I think this is beautiful. This, if you look at the King James, kind of parallels the NIV a little bit. This is he whom I spake. He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. They translate preferred. They use gegongen, which is that he was caused to be. But what it says is, he was whom I said, he is coming after me. He was caused to be in ahead of me, because he was before me. Do you see what this is? This is a beautiful Greek irony and satire, and irony. It's a beautiful Greek irony, because what do we do as English speakers? We make this into an immediate euphemism, right? It's a euphemism, because he is coming after me, right? He's coming after me. That makes sense. He was caused to be ahead of me? Wait. We immediately say that's a euphemism because it's euphemistically ahead of me. What do you think he's saying? Why was he ahead of him?
Does it mean above him or?
Well, the punchline is this one, but that's good. Good thinking. The punchline is right here. Because he was before me. Right? That's the argument. Is right. I gave it to you right here. The argument, remember, and I'll go over this argument, but the argument at the beginning, and who is this guy? We still don't know who this guy is. We haven't got the punchline. But what John says is, and this is Greek, so it's concrete. It's not euphemistic. He says, he came before me. He's coming I said he's coming after me. So he's coming after me. Okay, that makes sense. He was caused to be ahead of me. What? Because he was before me.
Four-dimension thing.
Yeah, it's that four-dimensional thing. It's the God who exists now, and this guy he's talking about, whoever he is, because we don't know the punchline yet, this guy is pre-existent. Wow. I mean, we take these verses, and yeah, this kind of, makes sense to us. He that cometh after me is preferred before me. See, what did the NIV say? He is preferred before me. NIV said, he who comes after me has surpassed me. Surpassed me. But that takes the physical out of it, really. Surpass is a euphemistic idea. How do you know that I'm greater than you? Well, what do? You make more money, you have, more people on Twitter, you know what I'm saying? What makes you surpass me? In English, that's a euphemistic kind of idea. We make those decisions on our own, but they're all euphemistic. It's not concrete, unless you're physically ahead of me, right? Or you physically, I don't know, maybe if you're the boss. But even then, I know most of us think, well, no, we don't most of us think, but some people think that, hey, I could be a better boss than my boss, or I could be a better boss than the boss's boss, right? Then why aren't you? Oh, that's the rub. So I think this is really beautiful. And the Greek, remember, when we take this into the context of Greek culture, this is, I put it there, beautiful Greek statement, beautiful Greek argument in a single statement. There's only one conclusion from this logos. Christ is God, period. Or the punchline. Who the punchline is God. That's it, right? He was coming after me physically. He was caused to be ahead of me physically and in importance, and he was before me. He was pre-existing as God. So, do you see how there's irony in this? Irony, what's another word? There's, it's just a concrete statement that pops, especially in the Greek, in the cultural understanding of the Greek. So let's continue on. Out of his fullness we have received grace in place of grace already given. Out of his fullness we have received grace in place of grace already given. Boy, that's a euphemistic statement in English. Here's the Greek, here's the King James. And of his fullness have we received, and grace for grace. A little bit different understanding in the King James. Here's the Greek, and I'll give you the, here's the literal. Because, and what's really interesting, and I try not to do this, in a cultural translation, what I want you to do is get a feel for the language. And so the words that I translate, I try to go back to the original Greek sense of the word. So I look at Woodhouse and Vines and Strong's and a few other sources to see if I can grasp a hold of that thing. Because one thing I don't like to do is you notice we haven't seen it yet much in John, but it's there. I'm going to point it out to you. Our translators take the same word and translate it in 5 ways. And you go, well, wait a second. It's Greek. Isn't it one word? Well, some words do, some prepositions do take different, not really hugely different meanings, but different meanings based on whether they're accusative or nominative or dative or genitive case. So, yes, some prepositions can do that, and I try to point that out or fix the translation when they do. But in general, for example, hoti means because. They translate it for. Ek means from out or out from among. So they've already translated and fixed it for you in this. This is the version I grabbed it. They just say, oh, it's got to be from, period, right? And they pick and choose which articles they want to throw out. I throw in all the articles so you can see them, and I also point out in the literal translation what they are. For example, this is a genitive, the, so it's of the, of fullness. So that's what I have here. Because, out from, or out from among, of the, what fills or what is filled. This pleromatos means what fills or what is filled. Auto, of him, himas, we. Pantes is pas. If you remember in Hebrews, the version I had only gave the basic form. So this is pas, but it's pantes. It has different writing spellings because of its parts of speech as it fits into Greek. But all of the whole, e labomen. Remember, labos labos. The basis of this word is lambane. Lambane, we have translated it many times as received. It is not received. It is to grasp hold of. I guess you could receive grasp hold of if somebody threw you a ball. But the word literally means that you're close enough. And your kids do this, don't do this. Remember what your kids do when they're throwing a football, right? Like 2 feet away, and he's like, bang, right? If this hasn't happened to you or your kids, then you haven't lived the life yet. But kids do that, right? And so I guess if you're that close and some kid throws a ball at you, you could say you lambanoed the ball by receiving it very heartily. But the word means to grasp hold of. And so I translate, and I haven't gone over verbs yet, but elambano is, in elambano, and you notice the word is, it's not lambano, right? Why? Because it is the part of speech that it means, and it's verb type. It's translated have received. So I say here, or the Ilamano took hold of, and charan, graciousness of manner or act. Anti. Anti means opposite. Charitos, of graciousness or manner of act. I've seen this a lot, and they did this in Hebrew a couple of times. The word anti, well, you know what the word anti means, right? I don't have to teach you that one. It's the same in English. What does it mean? Yeah, opposite. Anti means to be against or opposite something. In Greek, anti means opposite. It indicates the opposite. So when you see it in English, or when you see a translation, it should be opposite, right? Wake up. Wake up.
Did you fix your settings yet?
I need to fix my settings. Again.
The voice from the back.
The voice in the back. All right, here's the translation. This is a cultural translation. So I took the words that they had fixed for you, and I fixed them back into the Greek, the common Greek. Because from out of that which filled him, we took hold of everything, and graciousness of manner or act, instead of the opposite of graciousness of manner or act. Does this make more sense? It doesn't? Okay, let's look at the King James or the NIV again. Here's what the King James says. And of his fullness we have all received grace for grace. And grace for grace, right? We have received and grace for grace. Also, in the NIV, it says, out of his fullness we have received grace in place of grace already given. Now, wait a second. Where did they get already given and grace in place? Where do those words come from? They're not in the Greek. You just make them up? Do they want to? What are they pushing here? I don't know. I don't think it's a good translation. This is the Greek right here. This is a cultural translation. Because from out of that which filled him, we took hold of everything, and graciousness of manner or act, instead of the opposite. That makes sense to me. I hope it makes sense to you. Don't you think that's what what John would tell you? That instead, that because of Christ, or because of we haven't heard who this is yet. We don't know who this is. But because of this being or person, we have grace instead of the opposite of grace. That makes sense to me. So if you've ever read those verses, which I have, and go, huh? What? It's because your translators failed you. Now I didn't check all the other Bibles to see which ones were closer, or maybe Amplified Bible has a better translation. But I just was kind of not as happy about that translation, because this runs right into the punchline. Here's the punchline. NIV. For the law was given through Moses' grace, and truth came through Jesus Christ. That's why he introduced grace, graciousness of manner or act, because the next stage is, remember, this is the Greek logos to telos, it's a logical argument, and this is an unstated telos. And you say, how is that an unstated telos? He didn't make a conclusion. He just, this is why when we get to this point, we miss the point. What do we expect to see in English when you reach the conclusion? In conclusion, the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, right? But he doesn't say that. He keeps the argument going. And this is the way Greek does. We have two unstated teloses. Let's look at the cultural translation of this. Here's the Greek, and then here's our King James. For the law was given by Moses, not by grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. And I'll point it again. Whenever you see italics in the King James, and I don't know what the NIV does, but the King James indicates with italics words that are added. They just pulled in. Here's a translation, because, again, hote, because the nomos, the law, and I put in parentheses Torah. When any New Testament author talks about the law, the nomos, They're talking about the law of Moses. Dia, through Moses, Edothe, was offered the graciousness of manner or act, and the not false, aletheia, not false, dia, through Jesus Christus. Jesu Christu, egento, he caused to become. Okay, the Greeks have funny word order, but remember that's their word order, and it's logical and reasonable to them. In English, it doesn't make as much sense to us, but if we put it in the correct word order, here's a translation. Because the law was offered through Moses, the graciousness of manner or act, and the not false was caused to become through Jesus Christ. I personally think that is much more powerful than the translation that they gave us in both the NIV and the King James. And this also points to another thing. This is that unstated logos to telos. This is the unstated telos of the logos. And so we look at, and I gave you, this is my cheat sheet, okay? I don't know if I'm going to do this with every one of them. I thought this was, this may be valuable, it may not be valuable, but this is the verse-by-verse argument that John has made. We got to the punchline. We now know, who's he talking about? Jesus Christ. But the argument that started at the beginning is, first he says, logical argument equals God. That's the first verse. Then he says, the logical argument created the cosmos, and life equals light. Remember, we looked at the whole thing. Light is the first thing created. It's created by the Amar. The next it says, logical argument equals the source of light, which equals life. These are all the Greek direct statements. Logical argument equals light equals life, and it's greater than darkness. Remember the darkness, whole thing? John equals a witness. John is not the source of light. Again, this is a mystery, a mystery leading up to the telos. The source of light is coming into the cosmos, and subparts of this was the source of light was not realized. The source of light was not taken hold of. And if it was taken hold of, you become a child of God. The next set was logical argument equals became flesh and equals God in flesh. Do you see how this is progressing? This is a progressive argument that where John is giving you a Greek argument that is a proof text to what he's going to finally conclude, right? We read it and we go, oh, that's sweet. But John wants you to look at it as a logical argument to finally reach the punchline or the telos.
Well, just to comment on this verse, when you read it in the King James, it doesn't say that the law is the grace is a consequence of the law, but the translated version basically does state that there would be no grace if there wasn't the law from Moses, is what it's actually saying. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. What it does in this proof text, this logical argument, this reasoned argument, is it ties together what we miss. We just see this as a verse. It's a throwaway, right? We know who Jesus is. We know what stuff is. It's a throwaway. But what John means for you to see is it's not a throwaway. This verse is supposed to tie together all the arguments from the beginning. Right? We read, in the beginning was the Word. The logical argument. And the logical argument was God. And we read that and we go, well, that's cool. But the point that John's making isn't just that. He's laying a foundation for an argument that reaches to this verse. And in this verse, we suddenly have the telos. It's an unstated telos. You say, well, how is that an unstated telos? Because it has Jesus in it, right? The reason it's an unstated telos is if we were in English or Latin, we would expect the author to say, and therefore the conclusion of my argument, the conclusion of who the logical argument is, the conclusion of who is also God, the conclusion of all this stuff is Jesus Christus, right? But he doesn't say that. Why doesn't he say that?
He's writing in Greek.
Well, yeah, he doesn't need to say it. Every Greek person who hears this or reads this, well, they're going to be only hearing it in this period, pretty much, because you're self-reading, right? They're all mnemonics. So everyone who hears this, to them it's obvious what he's doing. And so we get to this. John's argument, his witness, the logical argument became flesh and God in flesh. He has to make that reason because he is going to argue, he has argued already that the flesh, Jesus Christ, is also God. You know, this is pretty deep stuff, right? I mean, have you ever heard anybody really? I mean, I know we say it all the time in our when we do the Nicene Creed, the creeds, the Apostolic Creed. But you know, we kind of just say it, right? But what John is doing is he's leading us down an argumentative path, a logical reasoned path, where the conclusion is, therefore, Jesus Christ is God, is flesh, is the Logos, the logical argument, is the Amar of God, who is God, who created the cosmos. Look what else it says. It's beautiful stuff. John's argument, he says, he's coming after me. He was ahead of me. He was before me. Do you see what John's doing there? John is already preparing you in this argument to ensure you didn't miss the point. See this? I mean, it's one thing for me to say, you know, for John the Immerser to go up and say, well, you know, this Jesus guy, he's God. Right? That's one thing. But what John, the gospel writer, wants to do is lead you rationally so you get to the same conclusion he did. And by the way, John the Immerser, look at what his argument parallels. His argument, he's coming after me, he is ahead of me, and he was before me. How's the only way he could be ahead of me and before me? He's got to be pre-existent, right?
Do you think this comes out of that whole thing of where they said every generation there's a new Messiah? And so John feels the need that he's got to show that Jesus is God.
I think all the gospel writers did that in a different way. Each one had a different logos to tell us. But I think that of all the Gospels, John is probably the most Greek. I know people say it's not. I mean, we looked at Mark. But I do think that John is probably, from a logical or reason standpoint, is probably more Greek than everybody else. He really, really was trying to express this to the Greeks and to who else? The Romans. That's why he's using these terms, that he's not just throwing out terms. He's putting things in a logical context that he expects us to be Greek readers and thinkers, so we put it together and we understand it. Look how he continues. He says that other verses, life equals light equals grace filled him, right? We just read that. He says Moses equals law and Jesus Christ equals grace and truth. Actually it says not false, but I put in truth because Greeks did not have a word for truth. They had a word for not false. The unstated telos is Jesus Christ equals the logical argument equals God. This is almost, if I parse this out for you, it would be if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, right? This is exactly what this argument is, except it's using the logical argument and God and Jesus Christ. There is more to it, though, because John is leading you down a logical path. The unstated telos is that Jesus Christ equals the logical argument equals God, and the unstated telos, taking hold of Christ, equals you being, at the top it said, that if you, the source of light is coming into the cosmos. So who's the source of light? Obviously, Jesus Christ. That's what John wants you to know. The source of light was not realized. The source of light was not taken hold of. But if you take a hold of it, you can become. Yep. Now, our problem is, what do we want? Well, you know, I keep beating this horse, but it's an important horse to beat. In English, we want the guy to tell us. you want them at the beginning to say, I'm going to prove that Jesus Christ equals God, and etc. Right? And that's what you say. That's what that's what you expect, because that's what a reasoned argument for a Latin person or an English speaker to say to work. Right? And you want at the very end, he's going to say, therefore, Jesus Christ equals God. That's what you want to see. And you want to see also that he says, therefore, if you take hold of Jesus Christ, you can become a child of God. He wrote that already for you. The only problem is, he put it kind of in a reverse order. You notice how the Greek has a little bit of different word order than we're used to? The Greek person would, I can assure you, if I had Socrates right here, Socrates would tell you that you are irrational. That your mode of speaking in English language is totally irrational. You should never start with the subject. You should always start, he would say, with the declarative point and then the verb. He'd want to start with the verb. That's what Greek mostly does. And he'd want to have a declarative thing, like, accordingly, certainly, because. We do that occasionally in English, right? He'd say that's what you need. And he said, then I'm going to tell you the verb, because the verb is the most important thing. And then I'm going to let you know who I'm talking about. Shazam! And you'd go, well, I don't have an argument. Well, you might. If you're a good grammar teacher, you say, well, it makes sense to have the, to start with the who it is I'm going to talk about. And that's what we argue in English, right? Just saying, different cultures have different ways of looking at things. And so, therefore, it should amaze us that we don't have a better form of grasp of logical reasoning. The Greeks seem to have. This guy, John, we'll learn more about John, but I told you, John, he may be a priest of the priestly family, he may be a Levite, maybe an Aaronite. He's obviously pretty well educated. A lot better educated than most of us, appears, right? At least he knows Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. He knows Latin. So, yeah, most of us can barely get along in English, right? Help me, right? So let's go on. I've got some notes here. This is an interesting statement. It brings the Jewish Torah into the context of Christ. As we know, the Torah was insufficient to redeem from sin. That was the Torah class, right? I'll just remind you that. Only graciousness from Christ could save. That's what we'll get into more of. And this is the punchline. This is the conclusion of the argument. The mystery stated as an argument. This is what the argument represented results in. And it is an unstated telos. And I put the overall logical argument also in the text. Like I said, I don't know if this is totally worthwhile. I don't know if I'm going to do it with the rest. But, okay. John is not going to leave you hanging. He's going to continue his argument. And look how he does it. I think this is really fun. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God, and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. What did he just do? He just took his argument, and he told you the punchline is Jesus Christ, the Son, Son, and Telos, and now he is
Doubling down on it.
doubling down on it. Yep, I love this. So let's see what it says. Like I said, most of this little differences, they don't affect things. They don't affect the way you think about things, really. Well, they may affect the way you think about stuff, but I think it does in a positive way, right? When we see a little difference in the translation. No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. Ooh, I like that. That's not too bad. Here's the literal. The literal here. Theon, God. Otis, not even one. Herakin has stared at. The word, and this word is translated many times in the modern and the NIV as, many times it's translated as seen. What did the NIV translate as? Did they do see? If they did, I'm going to be surprised. Yeah, they have seen. What I want to point out to you is we will see that this word, heroken, has stared at, is not usually translated as seen. It's usually translated as understand in modern translations. Now again, when I try to translate the Greek, I want to go back to the original word forms in the way the Greek speakers and readers would be thinking of it. So yes, it does have some connotation to mean to understand. But what have you just done when you do that? To go from to stare at and to understand is a euphemistic use of the words. I told you, Greeks are not euphemistic thinkers. They are concrete thinkers. So yes, it may mean that they understand it. They see it physically. They see it, like Missouri, right? The show me state. If I see it, right, I can believe it. I can know it. That's where it comes from. But the reality is the Greek reader or speaker is going to be thinking, stare at it. So it means that I know it because I've seen it. Anyway, that's why I don't retranslate that into many of the forms that the other translations will do. At any time, when edges the only born theos, he being, right there, right? That's the declarative form or the identity form, he being, and you notice it doesn't have a pronoun. They didn't feel like they needed a pronoun. Now some translators will say, well, the provides the pronoun, kind of ish, kind of not. I'm not in that camp. They want to say one or this or there. Yeah, you can throw those in, but I would say just throw in the declarative pronoun that goes into the verb he. Heis, two are into ice, two are into the bosom, kalpan, a bosom, of the father, of a father. These are genitive terms. Ekainos, that one thing, egisato, to consider out. Okay, let's see what this can translate to. Not even one at any time has stared at God. Not one at any time has stared at God. Ooh, I like that. That's a neat, very concrete, direct statement. That one thing to consider, the only born God being into the bosom of the Father. This is what it says. One thing to consider, the only born God being into the bosom of the Father. What did that just tell us? Jesus is God, and he said he was flesh before. He's the only born God. He being, let's see, the reason that you read it this way is because the God is used, if you notice, it says God twice. Now our translators in the King James, no man has seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, which is the bosom of the Father. Wait, the Greek says God twice. Right here. Directly. Theon. Theon. The reason theon and theos is because this is the accusative, and this is the nominative case of the verb. So theon, God. Theos, God. Well, it has God twice. Well, what happened to King James? Did they just throw out a God? They did. What about the NIV? What did the NIV give us? No one has ever seen, look what they did. No one has ever seen God, but the only one, the one and only Son, who is himself God, and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. So the NIV translators didn't throw out the other God, and they actually captured the meaning. I know it's not perfect English. I just like cultural translations, though, because it really gives me, if we keep the words short and don't, you notice how in English we throw in a whole bunch of extra words, right, to make it fit, or to make it more clear, easier to read, right, for us. Not even one at any time has stared at God. I like that. That one thing to consider, the only born God. Why didn't they say that? Is huios in here? Is any other word for son or paedon or child in there? No.
Well, does say father, so that kind of implies maybe a son or a sibling or a child.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, okay, so every time I talk about father, I'm talking about son too, right? Oh, no, I can't be doing that. I'm just saying, you know, our translators, why didn't they want to say this? I mean, I think this is great theology. My personal opinion is. But what they didn't want to say, that one thing to consider is the only born God. What did they just say? Well, we know that Jesus Christ is God. And I keep telling you that Brown is crazy, right? And the people who think that the church suddenly made up in the 2nd century or 3rd century, well, they never believed that Jesus was really God. It says that Jesus is God, the only born God. Wait a second. That kind of throws, it just took all their ideas and just kind of put it into the trash can, right? It round-filed every single word they said. You think they could be lying to you? Yeah, they either don't know Greek or they're just lying to you. It's okay. There's lots of those around. And you know, the father of Father of Elijah. We're not talking about theology, right? We're just talking about the words. And this is beautiful. Not even one day, anytime it stared at God, that one thing to consider, the only born God being into the bosom of the Father. Remember I told you, it always says in the Greek that Christ is beside God. This just said that what is Christ? Embraced by God. Held by God. Yes, that is kind of euphemistic, but it's beautiful, right? And yes, sir.
To me, I think one of the things that really kicks that is the only born God. Because there you're making a distinction between God in flesh as opposed to God, not the flesh.
Yeah, and I could go into, I do have a little time to go into that. That is a really great comment and statement, because who are born as gods in Greek and other cultures? Anybody know what they're called?
Demigods?
Demigods, yes. Hercules is a demigod. When a god came and had sex with a human female, or a god female had sex with a male, they would produce children that were demigods. And some had powers of demigods. There's huge mythos culture, mythos ideas in the Greek. I write about a lot of this. I really love this as an idea. But you know what? It's all myth, right? It's all fiction. It's really cool stuff. But what he's saying is, and this basically completely destroys that idea that Christ is a demigod, which, by the way, is an Arian viewpoint to a degree, right? That what? That God said the Holy Spirit have sex with Mary, and there Mary produced a demigod. Where John has argued from the very beginning that Jesus Christ is God. And as we noted, it's that four-dimensional being projected into three dimensions. Look, they didn't understand any of that. John certainly understood a lot of it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, John said, nobody can see me and live, so you have to be equal to God if you're going to be in His presence as bosom, embraced.
Exactly. Yeah, and Tammy's reading a lot of sources, Torah stuff for her studies, this thing, and she was looking at all the verses where it talks about like Moses seeing God, etc. I think the problem with us is we read translations. What we really need to do is either talk to our rabbi, or we need to get into the Hebrew and see what it really says, because the Hebrew rabbis even tell you that no man has stared at God, no man has seen God, right?
But then there were a whole bunch that had breakfast with him.
They had breakfast with him, but it doesn't say they saw him.
I know.
And also, remember Moses, we get the impression, remember Moses, God was hidden in a bush, right? Or by a fire. So I'm just saying that as you read the Old Testament, many of the conclusions we make happen to be incorrect conclusions. And remember, Hebrew is really euphemistic. It is more euphemistic than English. It is so euphemistic, you can't get away from its euphemism, right? Where Greek is concrete. Yes, sir.
Part of the puzzles me with this statement, though, is at the beginning it says no one has ever stared at God, but then we have God born, and everybody stared at him because he was here. So, is there not a parallel? What's the disconnect between those two?
I personally don't think there's a disconnect because what it's, there are lots of ways of looking at that thing about, not us seeing God. If I went and drew the model of the cosmos for you again, right, we know that God is outside the cosmos. So therefore, if you see God, the Father, in his fullness, it means that you have to be, well, a four-dimensional being. Which, by the way, is a promise that we see that as children of God, you are going to be, and we hear this in Hebrews. Remember Hebrews? We did 5 years of Hebrews. Hebrews says that we will be like God, right? That we will be inheritors of Christ. The point being that when can I look at God? Well, if God comes in the flesh, the sarx, right? Then I can see him because he is suddenly a what kind of dimensional being? A three-dimensional being in time. Which means that I don't have to be a four-dimensional being to see God. I think, our thinking, and you're a great thinker, but our thinking generally tends to be what we see culturally in our event horizon, right? And so maybe if we were physicists thinking about four dimensions all the time, we see everything as tesseracts. Probably not. But you see, that's just the way we think, right? And so we have thought, and I'm going to throw this out because this is absolutely true, for 2,000 years, we have thought, well, maybe not. Maybe since, there are keynote points in our thinking where our thinking has kind of changed a little bit. It wasn't supposed to. We're supposed to be natural theologists, in the ilk of the early apostles, the early disciples. That's what we're supposed to be. And so we continually try to do that. But guess what we've got? We've got 2,000 years of tools, theology, doctrine, all those wonderful things that help us to know, right? But what have they also done? They've hindered us. They've prevented us from understanding, I think, that's what I want you to do. I want you to walk with John. Not walk with John like John in the desert, hungry, starving, maybe going to the chief priest thing, not in that sense, but in the sense of thinking like John was thinking like John the Immerser was thinking, and ultimately thinking like, well, at least Jesus Christ has been projected to us, right, by these logical, reasoned arguments. I think that's the point, right? And to us, we're used to thinking in a certain way, which is great, but it, you get that brown guy and other people saying, they say all the time, that, well, the church just made up this idea about Jesus being God. Well, it just said that he was born. He was born God. Wait, all you got to do is show Brown that and go, and all those books are trash, right? Yes, sir.
Well, there's the progressive Christianity, where the movement that's going on now that's trying to deny that Jesus is really God.
Mm-hmm.
So they can make the statement that the God is all one. The Moses God, or God of the Muslims, God of the Jews, is all the same God. Although the God of the Jews is the same God.
Yeah, Tübingen School started that, so I always want to bring up Tübingen School. That's their fault. Reject everything from Tübingen School. Q, all that silly stuff is all made up. Again, that's 2,000 years of some of the stupidity that we've had to put up with, right, in Christianity. Let's just go back to the Greek and see what it really says, right? We can start with this last one, but I think this is beautiful. This statement directly calls Christ God and expresses that Christ is born into the bosom of God. That presumes that Christ knows the heart of God and is God, because it says it. Okay, and here's John the Baptist. Now, here's 19. So, John the gospel writer, John the apostle, has given us a logos to tell us. He gave us a punchline. He gave us the secret of who he's talking about. And now, remember he brought up John? Guess what? There's another logos to tell us that already started back when it said John's argument. Remember that? He brought up John. We don't know who this John the Immerser is. He's not even John the Immerser yet. We don't even know about baptism. or anything yet. It just, the author brought up this John guy. And he said that John's argument, that whoever this guy is coming after me, he was ahead of me, he was before me, which is really a beautiful and amazing statement in Greek. And then now we get this. The next logos to telos is running parallel to this one. This is the way Greek works. So you already brought up John. That's the beginning of the logos to telos, and he told us about John. Now this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. I left in the highlights or the titles from the NIV. Kept them in. This is a record of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who art thou?" It's really interesting that he doesn't use the word, what word? The S word. Sadducees. Now we're going to see he uses the word Pharisees all the time. Why might he not use the word Sadducees? Because he probably is one. If he's a Sadducee, you don't need to say, "Hey, them Sadducees are coming down." What do? You specify. It's the Levites and priests. Who's the Levites and priests? They're Sadducees that happen to be Jewish people. That the priests are Aaronites. The Levites. This is another proof text that kind of points to the fact that good old John the Apostle was probably an Aaronite, and probably a Levite, and probably of a priestly family, maybe. We'll see, there's more evidence of that. This is the Greek, we don't have time to go into the thing, I'll start with this though. And this, Estin, is the martyria, the witness, the evidence or testimony or reputation of the Ionin of John, at which thing to set apart. This word we'll see a lot. I think it's mistranslated, okay. It means in Greek to set apart, but they use it to be to send, right? Sent. To set apart forward to him the Jews from out of Jerusalem, priests and Levites, in order that they might interrogate him. Thou, it's you. I took out the thou forms, but the psi forms and the thou forms. Who, which, what, and I give us the choice because many times it translated as this is that, and I think it's more declarative in the English or in the Greek. But anyway, you are. And next week we'll start with 19. So, thank you, Father, for your word. I pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.
Prayer, Lord.